Blood is responsible for carrying oxygen to the tissues and delivering it to the tissues, but it's also responsible for carrying carbon dioxide away from the tissues back to the lungs. Now, red blood cells sit within plasma. So that's sort of my diagram of a red blood cell. And at the tissues, you have carbon dioxide that's going to enter into the plasma, and some of it is just going to stay as dissolved CO2. And it's not great, it's about 7% of it stays dissolved inside of the plasma. Okay, so some of it enters these red blood cells. Now, some of it will get picked up by hemoglobin. So, hemoglobin plus carbon dioxide, right? And that's going to get you what we call carboxyhemoglobin, HbCO2. And that's about 23%. Right? So, in total, we got about 30%. So, what happens to the rest of it? Okay, so what happens to the rest of it? We have to remember a little bit of chemistry. Inside of our red blood cells, we have water. And if we take water and we combine it with carbon dioxide, right, we are going to get sort of an equilibrium equation with that forming carbonic acid, H2CO3, and then carbonic anhydrase can convert that into a proton plus bicarbonate, HC3O minus. Okay, so now we've got all these sort of free protons in here, right? So inside of our red blood cell, we have our bicarbonate, HC3O minus, right? But then we're going to get all of these protons inside of here, like so. Now the protons can be taken up by hemoglobin itself, right? But what's going to happen is that chloride is going to exchange with that bicarbonate so that the bicarbonate ends up inside of the plasma. And that's where most of our carbon dioxide, 70% of it, is transported, and how it's transported. Okay, but notice one of the things that I want you to notice, right, is at the level of our tissues, right, we're creating all these free protons from this acid, right? We're going to change the pH. How did changes in the pH alter the red blood cells' sort of ability to unload that oxygen from the hemoglobin, right? It shifted that oxygen hemoglobin affinity curve, or caused the Bohr effect, right? So that's kind of an important little feature there, right? Now, the red blood cells are going to transport this to the lungs, okay? And so at the lungs, things are going to sort of reverse, right? So the hemoglobin that has the CO2, the carboxyhemoglobin, right, is going to release it. Right? And so we get our free hemoglobin. Right? One of the things that happens is, remember, at the lungs, that oxygen comes in and it binds to the hemoglobin. When oxygen binds to that hemoglobin, that's what kicks that CO2 off, and that is known as the Haldane effect. The Haldane effect. So the Haldane effect is when the binding of oxygen to hemoglobin decreases the affinity of hemoglobin for carbon dioxide, causing it to be released. Okay? The other thing that's going to happen is that our bicarbonate from the plasma is going to re-enter our blood cell in exchange for that chloride ion, so that we're going to reverse that chloride shift that happened in the tissues. Right? So now we have that bicarbonate inside of our red blood cells, and that bicarbonate then can bind with a proton, right? And it is going to form our carbonic acid, which then can be split into our water and our CO2. And then the CO2 can be transported into the alveoli. So we're just sort of at the lungs reversing the processes that happened at the tissues. And that's how carbon dioxide is transported in the red blood cells in the blood. One important thing to note, right, is that hemoglobin helps to bind these free protons. So the hemoglobin itself acts as a buffer inside of the red blood cells. So one of the things that can happen is if that hemoglobin can't pick up those free protons, right, that can lead to something called respiratory acidosis, because we're going to have more free protons inside of the red blood cells, right? So one of the things that's really important, right, is our hemoglobin's ability to serve as a buffer for acid-base balance. So the blood is involved in acid-base regulation.